tomorrow, so we have some pretty exciting things coming to the club. We're going to record all the lectures and post them online on a website, and there'll be a Q&A section on the website and some newsletters that we're working on implementing, so you guys don't have to wait till every Monday to get some questions answered, or if you have a conflict or something, you can get some questions answered on the website. Anyways, let's proceed. The debate was last week, so I'm curious to hear your guys' insights. Whoever watched the debate, what do you think were the most significant topics discussed in the debate? Or is there anything that caught your attention? Did anyone watch the debate? What did you find interesting?
Interesting. I wasn't going into the debate. I was going into the debate on the topic, so it was great to watch that. But there was a lot of talk about abortion. Really anti-result. But that was a big topic, and what I thought was really interesting was all the comebacks.
Yeah, I think with the debates, policies on social issues are definitely very popular. They're touchy subjects and very controversial, so they can sway a lot of votes with those talks. Here in this club, we're not going to talk about any of that. Like I said, they're very touchy, so we don't want to talk about any of that. We just want to analyze the fiscal policies and talk about how it'll affect the stock market. So looking at the next slide, let's take a look at Trump's fiscal policies. For those who weren't aware of his previous presidency, he incorporated the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. This act was initiated in January 2018, but it was announced in 2017. What this did was it reduced the corporate tax rates significantly. So initially, corporate tax rates were 35%, and he lowered it to 21%. If you don't know what that means, is say Apple had revenue of $100 billion. They would be taxed $35 billion of that revenue. After the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that $35 billion turned into $21 billion. So Apple had a lot more revenue that they could spend on other expenditures. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act also lowered income tax brackets. So whoever's parents, or maybe you guys were working a part-time job, following 2018, the income tax you're paying is significantly less than prior to that. Trump's administration is very in favor of increasing the defense budget, so many members of the U.S., many members of the Republican Party in history are very popular of increasing the U.S. military budget. They want to strengthen the U.S. military and make it a powerhouse, as y'all are probably familiar with. I'm sure many of you have heard of the trade war with China. Trump is very strong about making U.S. the most powerful country in terms of producing products domestically. He doesn't want as many products to be imported, but rather produced in-house. So he's imposing a tariff on goods internationally. There's also a tax on Social Security. So whoever receives a paycheck, a portion of that paycheck, I believe it's around 6%, is taxed towards a Social Security benefit. I'm not sure who has worked a job before, but I think the two main taxes you receive or that are taken out are income tax and then Social Security tax. So Trump wants to get rid of that Social Security tax. And then energy production. If you guys watched the debate, you probably heard a lot about oil fracking. If you're not familiar with oil fracking, it's just a process of getting oil from the ground. So Trump is very in favor of oil fracking and wants the U.S. to be one of the strongest producers of energy and fossil fuels.
And next we have Kamala's fiscal policies. One of her biggest ones is her healthcare for everybody. So basically she's a big supporter of Medicare, which is a government-run healthcare system that is supposed to help low-income people afford healthcare and have the government regulate the prices of medicine instead of private health insurers that often sneak prices in and try to charge you a little bit more. She's also a big supporter of sustainable energy. She shows this through her Green New Deal, which she plans to create a carbon tax on fossil fuel companies, which will tax them based on the carbon emissions they emit, and use this to reinvest into more sustainable energy companies. She's also a supporter of electric vehicles, so that's also something to look out for. One of Kamala's biggest policies is her minimum wage increase. She plans to increase the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15, which is more than double. This will really have an effect on states with a low cost of living, like Wyoming and Utah, states that typically have a lower minimum wage anyway. And this will definitely increase the quality of life for people working there. However, this brings us to question, how will companies react to this? Because companies are paying more out of their own pockets for minimum wage jobs, these minimum wage jobs might become more selective, or they might start to take back on them. Which leads us to Kamala's next policy, her 21st Century Skills Act. Now this is a government-funded employee training program which hopes to increase the baseline for workers working typically minimum wage jobs like I mentioned before. She's also a big supporter of making housing more affordable. She said many times that in this economy, finding housing is super difficult. And so she hopes to do this by giving credit to renters and homeowners that are paying a large portion of their income on their housing. And last but not least, Kamala hopes to fund many of these other fiscal policies by taxing the wealthy. And the wealthy being people earning $400,000 or more.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys notice any trends with Kamala Harris's fiscal policies. One thing you can notice is that most of them are tailored towards helping lower income families. That's her whole mission, helping the lower income families in the United States. Something very interesting about both Trump's administration and Kamala's administration's fiscal policies is that we didn't hear anything about all 12 of these policies in the debate. Whenever you hear about them on the news, the two main topics that are brought up are abortion and immigration. No one ever speaks about the fiscal policies, but this is the stuff that determines how much money we're keeping in our bank account. So it's really important to take note of all these. All right, let's take a deeper dive. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act was enacted in 2017. It officially took place in January 2018. And there's an expiration date of 2025. It reduced the corporate tax rates from 35 to 21%. So like I said before, there was a big reduction in corporate tax rates, so corporations had a lot more revenue. And then the lowered income tax brackets. So our parents, for example, probably noticed some more money in their bank accounts following that. Child tax credits. So most of us in 2018 were probably under 18 years old. Any U.S. citizen who is under 17 or under 18 received a child's tax credit of initially $1,000. Because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, this was raised to $2,000.
And another part of the tax of the TCJA is that it doubles the amount of tax deductibles that you can take away from your income. So for every state, there's a certain amount of money of your income that you can write off as deductible, and this pretty much almost doubled the amount for every state.
Yeah, so like I talked about before, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act gave corporations the opportunity to have more revenue that they could use for capital expenditures. It took place and it was announced in around April of 2017, but the actual Tax Cut and Jobs Act was effective January 2018. So here you can see the S&P from April 2018 to January 2018, or April 2017 to January 2018. It went up about 22%. Investors were very, very happy with corporations having more money because since they had more money, they were expecting, okay, now that the corporations have more money, maybe they'll give back to the investors through dividends, right? They have all this extra income. Maybe they'll give back with higher dividends. They could also invest in technological advancements. So maybe Apple puts more money into investing into a better iPhone or NVIDIA and their chips. They have this opportunity since they have more capital, so investors took that as a strong sign and the market went up over 20%. So it's very good for the stock market. Like I said before, these are the income tax brackets. So If you're earning $600,000, initially you were taxed almost 40%, it reduced to 37%, and then you can see all the tax brackets and they're getting reduced. Most of us are within the 15% to 33% tax bracket, so our parents are probably very satisfied that they're paying less income tax following the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Like I said before, there is an expiration date. So this Tax Cut and Jobs Act took act in 2018, but it's set to expire in the end of 2025 or early 2026. So let's look at both administrations and how they're going to handle this. So Trump's response to the TCJA is that he wants to lower corporate tax rates even more. So it went from 35% to 21%. He wants to lower this to 15%. We saw how good the economy reacted when the TCJA went into effect. If he lowers it to 15%, it might even be even better for the economy. With the income tax brackets, he wants to extend it. So instead of the income tax being reverted back to the original amount, he just wants to extend the lower income tax. And then the child tax credit. As we mentioned before, it went from $1,000 to $2,000. He wants to raise this to $5,000.
And as for Harris's response to the TCJA, contrary to Trump, she's actually hoping to raise corporate taxes to 28% because of her beliefs. And as for income tax, she does not hope to change any of the income tax brackets under $400,000. However, for those earning more than $400,000, she does hope to tax them more and hopes to be able to fund the rest of her policies. And similarly to Trump, she's also hoping to increase the child tax credit. However, instead of being $2,000 to $5,000, she's hoping to do $2,000 to $6,000.
Yeah, so like we talked about before, there's a trade war with China that Trump suggested. He wants to increase the tariff on imports. I'm not familiar with the numbers. I believe it was something maybe close to 20%. But this will decrease international imports significantly. Since we won't have as many international imports on goods, we're going to need to create jobs or different services in the US to produce those goods, right? Like if we're getting toys from China, if we're no longer getting those toys from China, we have to manufacture those toys in the US. Since we have new manufacturers, it's going to create new jobs. So new jobs will open up in the US with this tariff on imports. It's also going to rely less on foreign production and make the US a stronger domestic producer. Like we said before, there's a tax on Social Security. Trump wants to get rid of the 6.2% Social Security tax. Now the little confusing part about this is, if we get rid of the Social Security tax, what's going to happen to the Social Security benefit, right? When we retire, where is that money going to come from if we're not being taxed from it? Trump being confusing, he hasn't spoken about this policy yet. He hasn't said what he's going to do to make this work. He just said he wants to get rid of the Social Security tax, so we need to keep an eye out in the next couple months of if he adds anything to that policy of how he's going to make it work. And then an increase in energy production. Like we saw in the debate, Trump is very big into oil fracking. He wants to expand drilling and fracking practices and make the U.S. one of the strongest producers in oil and fossil fuels. This will create energy independence and less reliance on foreign oil, just making the U.S. a stronger producer and more domestically powerful.
And for Kamala's first policy, or Medicare for All, she hopes to replace private health care insurers with a government-funded health care for everybody. Now, this is in hopes to reduce the amount that people spend on health care because there's going to be less out-of-pocket expenses and certain premiums that private health insurers often like to sneak into the village when you go to the hospital. She hopes to do this over 10 years as to not economically shock everybody, because you'll have a bunch of people switching over from the private healthcare insurance to Medicare for All.
Yeah, I want to share you guys a little story that I've experienced. Someone in my family had an emergency a couple months ago, and they had to go to the hospital. As it was an emergency, they didn't have anything saved up. Their bill following the hospital visit was $10,000. Now, I don't know how many lower income families can afford such an emergency like that, but thankfully for my family, because of saving practices, it wasn't too much of an issue. But Kamala Harris's Medicare for All policy is for those lower income families, so they're not financially devastated after an emergency like that.
Another policy that Kamala believes heavily in is green and renewable energy, and she does this through her Green New Deal. The first part of her Green New Deal is enacting a carbon tax, which will levy a tax on a lot of fossil fuel companies and reinvest this tax into green energy companies. She also hopes to create more jobs in the green energy industry so that it can grow further in the future and we can become less and less reliant on fossil fuels. Another part of her Green New Deal is that she's focusing on public transit and electric vehicles. She hopes to make both of these more accessible by making public transit more widely accessible through a city, and she's also hoping to put more rechargeable stations for electric vehicles throughout cities.
Yeah, so Kamala's stance on this Green New Deal is a little confusing. For those who watched the debate, you probably would have heard Kamala say she's in favor of oil fracking. So both Kamala and Trump stated that they're in favor of it because it's good for the economy. What's confusing is the fact that in her last presidential campaign, she said something along the lines, don't quote me for this, I'm definitely not in support of oil fracking and I would ban it if I was president. Something around those lines. So it's a little confusing because she's contradicting herself, but her main policy, the Green New Deal, states that she wants more jobs for clean energy, and clean energy is a big factor for the environment as a whole.
And another notable policy for Kamala is her minimum wage increase. As stated previously, Kamala hopes to increase the previous federal minimum wage of $7.25 to $15. This will have devastating effects on people working these low-income jobs.
Yeah. So one thing notable about raising the federal minimum wage is that even though the federal minimum wage is in place, states have the option to have a different minimum wage. So, for example, I know in Florida, I believe the federal minimum wage the state minimum wage is like $11, something around those lines. I'm not sure California and New York, which are higher cost of living states, but it's probably closer to the $15 amount. So, since there's a different cost of living in states across the U.S., like the Midwest and the South, like Missouri, for example, is generally cheaper than states like California or the Northeast. What effect is this going to have on companies in the Midwest? Are they going to lay off employees? Are they going to invest in AI or kiosks, for example, to take over those minimum wage jobs? Or are they going to react very positively and just pay them more? It's something to keep an eye out for in the future.
And in response to this, Kamala hopes to enact her next policy, which is her 21st Century Skills Act. Now, because she raised the minimum wage to $15, companies are likely to have some sort of reaction to this, whether that be making these minimum wage jobs more competitive by increasing the requirements or by maybe laying them off. But through the 21st Century Skills Act, she hopes to train employees through another government-funded training program that will increase the baseline skill for all workers. And this is especially targeted towards skills that are needed in the future, such as cybersecurity and other technological skill sets. This is because she wants to make sure workers will have more opportunities in the future to get jobs, even if the bar is being raised by a lot. And another policy that Kamala talked about a lot throughout the debate was her housing policy. Now, Kamala is all for housing. She thinks that housing is way too expensive right now and people are having a difficult time affording it. So she puts the Rent Relief Act into action, which gives a tax credit to renters spending more than 30% of their income on their rent. This relieves a huge burden on renters so that they have more money to spend on other necessities such as food and other things. She also has a low-income housing tax credit, which is to help low-income and first-time home buyers. This is to help people buy their first house. She gives them a certain amount of money that she thinks fit and gives it to them in order to buy a new house. And also to help with this, she's also trying to help give more down payments and low interest loans to first-time home buyers so that they're able to afford their first home, because that's a big step in growing the economy.
Yeah, so like we mentioned in the fiscal policies, it's important to consider which investors are making an impact in the stock market, right? Kamala Harris's policies are tailored to the lower income families, whereas Trump's are more favored to corporations and lowering income tax as a whole. Low income families don't necessarily contribute a large amount to the stock market. So while her policies will be beneficial to them, it may not be beneficial to the market. One thing to keep in mind is when we do show you our opinions based on their policies and the impact it'll have on the stock market, I don't want you to buy this sector or buy a specific stock just because of their policies. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. For example, if we look at the last administration, the stock market didn't perform well in Trump's administration, and it performed very, very well. We're at all-time highs in Biden's administration. So obviously, the policies don't always align with the impact on the stock market. It's just a factor that could be an influence. So let's look at Trump's administrations and which stock sectors we think will be the best. We think the energy sector will definitely be positively influenced. If you look at the oil fracking and the initiatives Trump has suggested in his policies, you'll see that he's very adamant about making the U.S. a strong producer in oil and fossil fuels. This will definitely positively impact the energy sector, and we could see some good returns. There's also the financial services sector. Trump has briefly mentioned that he wants to deregulate the banks, so this will give them more freedom and potentially see some higher returns in the future. Industrials is a big sector. Like we talked before, Republican parties are generally in favor of making the U.S. military more powerful. He's talked about raising the budget for defense sectors, and then even with industrials. For example, when we're producing more goods in the U.S., we'll need access to more equipment. So companies like Caterpillar, which provide that equipment, could benefit a lot from Trump's administration. And then the overall S&P. Like we said before, with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we saw how it increased. We saw returns of 22% in the S&P with the decrease in corporate tax rates. If he plans to decrease the corporate tax rates from 21% to 15%, could we see some good returns in the S&P following that? It's a possibility, so it's definitely something to keep an eye out for.
And as for the sectors that Kamala's administration will strongly affect, we start with the renewable energy and electric vehicle sectors. So companies that probably sell electric vehicles will probably do well because of Kamala's interest in electric vehicles under her Green New Deal. We also believe that green energy sectors will also do well because she's hoping to levy taxes from fossil fuels, decreasing their prices and putting this back into renewable energy.
Yeah, so the electric vehicle sector is a little confusing because I don't know how many of you guys are following the news, but Elon Musk has actually endorsed Trump. So even though Trump is very big into energy production and Kamala is strongly in favor of electric vehicles, how are we going to see their policies align? Will Trump be in favor of Tesla and against all other EVs? Will he be against EVs as a whole, even though Elon Musk has endorsed him? It's going to be something to definitely keep an eye out for in the next several months.
And another notable factor of Kamala's policies is the healthcare sector. Now, we are unsure how Medicare for All will affect private health insurers because the government will now control the prices on all the medicine, and that might decrease profits for private health insurers. But I think we can agree that healthcare as a whole is likely to increase and do well during Kamala's administration because Medicare for all is going to bring more people under healthcare and make it more affordable.
Yeah, healthcare insurance companies are definitely going to be positively impacted because now more people will have access to healthcare. Alright, I'm opening up to Q&A. Please do not ask any questions about social policies. We know they're very touchy and we do not want to start any heated debate or anything in here, so please let's talk about fiscal policies, or I know the rate cuts are on Wednesday. If you have any questions about general stocks or this, feel free to ask.
Yeah, what do you think of what would happen when they cut like 25 basis points or 50 basis points?
Yeah, so it's the first rate cut in 4 years. I think it would definitely be good for the economy. I mean, more people will have access to money now since the rate cut has decreased. They can withdraw money at a lower interest rate, so they can in return put more money in the stock market. So it should be good for the economy. People are predicting either a 25 basis point rate cut versus a 50 basis point rate cut. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out for on Wednesday when the Fed has their meeting. Any other questions?
Yeah, Harris has mentioned taxes on unrealized capital gains. How do you think this would affect them?
Yeah, I saw that. I honestly didn't look into it as much. I don't know if that's practical, but it definitely would not be good for the stock market. So hopefully that's not its effect. I don't like any extra taxes, but I'm definitely going to research that more. But yeah, overall, it won't be good for the stock market if that happens.
Just earlier we talked about Trump's policies and him lowering the corporate income tax. What is like the trade-off for him doing that? Or why is he able to do that? Is there like some sort of trade-off for him lowering those taxes?
Yeah, so people have looked into the long-term impact of this, and they said it could have a negative long-term impact. Since the time of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we haven't seen a negative long-term impact from the lowering the income taxes. It's not a significant amount. It's like 2 or 3% from every tax bracket. Some of them stay the same, so we don't know what's eventually going to happen. And it is expiring next year, so it could revert back to normal. Kamala wants to increase the taxes of people making more than $400,000. But the issue is, when you lower taxes, that means less money for the government. So where is that money going to come from now? Will the government just have less money, or will it be replaced with something else? So it's something to keep an eye out for and look for and see where is extra money going to come from.
Yeah, so with that, where's that extra money going to come from? When raising the minimum wage, wouldn't that just make a lot of stuff in the economy just more expensive, or just push everything to a higher price?
Not necessarily. It will help the lower income families, but there is also the Skills Act where they're going to require more training, and it could lead to more development among people working in those minimum wage roles. Sometimes there could be a negative impact on the economy, but if it does keep the American citizens happy, then that's a trade-off, right? If they're saying that the $7.25 federal minimum wage is not livable, then you have to do something about it, right? Because inflation is rising slowly, but the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage is not rising. So it's definitely something to question.
Yeah, what would Harris's policies on the first-time home buyers, like a $25,000 credit, how would that impact the housing market?
So that would just it would help people afford housing, and it basically makes first-time home buyers more widespread. So like it'll increase the amount of people looking to buy a home instead of just renting and renting forever.
Yeah, I think she wants to deviate away from renting. Obviously, when you rent, you don't have an asset, so it's kind of a lose-lose. And more favored towards buying a house, so she wants to give that tax credit. So we citizens can have an asset under our name. Obviously, we've seen that the housing market appreciates in value. So when you buy an investment, over time it appreciates. When you buy a car, for example, it depreciates, but if you have that asset under your name, it'll help appreciate value. So by helping put the down payment or the tax credit, it'll give citizens an access to have an asset under their name. Any other questions? General stock questions?
Aren't like most of their policies kind of like continuations of like, you know, like the administration? Well, they are, but I think like Trump's is like, it's just his like past. 2017, right? It's just actually like, they used like raise rates and all that, but is it kind of like a continuation of their policies like Harris's? Is it just like a continuation of Biden's policies?
Yeah, you'll generally see a continuation. Trump obviously already had a presidency, so his policies won't shift that much. There'll be some differences. With Harris, the most notable one is oil fracking. I know with the child tax credit policy for Trump, I don't think he's in favor of raising the child tax credit, but J.D. Vance, his vice president, is in favor of raising the child tax credit to $5,000. So we'll generally see a continuation because it's something they're passionate about, and you wouldn't want to see a shift in values. Who did they ask about that? They asked Kamala about that in the debate. Or was it Trump? Something about their values changing, or what your values are. And you wouldn't want to see a change in that. You want them to be consistent and working to it. If they have a lot of changes, then they're like, okay, does this guy really know what they're talking about? Any other questions? Okay, well, keep an eye out for the website. I don't know when it's going to be live, but those two girls, Ruthie and Shivani, are working very hard to get that up. But we'll keep in touch about next week's meeting, and if you have any other questions, reach out to me after this meeting or just shoot me a text, and I'll be happy to answer some. All right, thanks for coming up.
Thank you.